Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us again for the Muslims on Turtle Island series. I suspect people will keep joining us over the next couple of minutes, but while they do so, I'll just try go through some of the housekeeping and basic things that we need to do. So my name is Aslam Bulbulia. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, the engagement coordinator at the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies at Simon Fraser University. I am joining from the unceded land of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and part of the land acknowledgement is a protocol of this land and the people of this land. And it's also a way for us to ground ourselves, particularly in this conversation about what does it mean to be Muslim on Turtle Island. For those of you who would like to learn more about the land that you're on, there's a great resource called nativeland.ca that you can check out. And you can also support that project through their Patreon page. We also welcome you to all introduce yourselves through the Padlet page that we've linked to in the chat box. And I saw some people introduce themselves yesterday. Thank you, Cynthia, for doing that. And as I read Cynthia's introduction, I thought of a wonderful resource to share with her. It's called Decolonial Futures. So I'll drop that in the chat box and Cynthia can go through that in her own time. It's my pleasure to welcome Fatima Jaffer, who is going to be our first speaker this morning. Fatima is a photographer, an activist, and a friend of the center, and a good friend that I've gotten to know over the last few weeks as we've worked together on this project. Fatima is having a little bit of issues with her internet, so she might have her video off for the majority of the section, but we do have slides that you will be looking at. One of the speakers yesterday asked if I would issue an invitation to everybody to turn their cameras on. And this is because it was difficult for some speakers to connect with the group and with the audience and just to increase the energy. So I know it's not possible for everyone because of internet issues or maybe the place that they're joining from, but if you can join with your camera on, that would be appreciated. Okay, and with that, I'm going to hand over to Fatima. Thank you so much.
Assalamu alaikum, and I'd like to begin by we're on the lands of Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh people. And the first point of my talk is related to that land acknowledgement. In terms of the importance of building relations with Indigenous people. After making an acknowledgement, and this is something I have been taught, is to reflect on why I'm making and whichever group of people. It's not something that we, as settlers, even settlers who didn't choose to be here, are saying to feel better about ourselves. So I have to remind myself always to say, why am I saying it? Why here and now? So today I made the land acknowledgement in recognition of ongoing settler colonialism and its everyday violences. And I'm thinking about the federal elections that are going on, and how none of the major parties are speaking out against the extreme actions of the RCMP to crush protests at Ferry Creek in Southwest Vancouver Island in contravention of UN agreements. And since May, 800 plus people have been arrested there. Journalists are being denied entry to logging areas. It's become the largest formal civil in terms of the response by the RCMP. So I make the land acknowledgement at a time when Indigenous unceded old growth forest land in BC is under one of the most intense attacks and unfettered destruction that we've seen lately. And also make the acknowledgement as an activist, a journalist, a photographer, an academic, a Muslim, a South Asian from Africa, a woman and queer. Because everything I do and achieve here happens on the backs of Indigenous people, of Coast Salish people, on whose unceded lands I've lived and worked since 1990. Further, to me, making the acknowledgement also means in practical terms that my activism, my academic work, my photography, and my politics require me by necessity to recognize, relate with, respect, give back, and manifest my solidarity with Indigenous people of this land. This is not despite me putting aside my own relation to colonialism in the lands that I'm from. It is because it's a continuum of historical, global anti-colonial struggles. And it's a part of my consciousness and politics while on this land and elsewhere, but on this land, not as a choice, but as an obligation and a responsibility of being here. So I think sorry. Ah. Okay. That was, yeah, these are just some of the photographs that I've taken over time and shared, with to the people in them who have copies of these. So that's, I've talked about, if you can go to slide 4. This is just a really embarrassing article that was written about me in 1994. And it was just to talk about, okay, myself. So I'm Shia Muslim from Mombasa. It's a town in Kenya that was 80% Muslim at the time I was growing up, albeit the rest of Kenya is primarily Christian. And it was a very diverse Muslim. Okay, getting the signal to turn my video off, so I will. Oh, it's off. Okay. So I came here when I was in my early 20s. I went to McGill in Montreal and the traditional territories of the Kenyan-born, and then to the University of Western Ontario on Chippewa of the Thames lands, where I got my master's degree in journalism. And I graduated with very high marks, but I couldn't get a job for years after because racism in the 80s wasn't as hidden as it is today. And it wasn't until affirmative action programs were a thing in the early 90s that I finally got to work as a journalist at a feminist newspaper called Kinesis, which was published by a women's organization, the Vancouver Status of Women. So the next slide, Austin. In those days, the women's movement was quite powerful, or at least influential. It was known, covered by mainstream media. It was even feared by politicians. I went to a few lobbies in Ottawa where they would, everyone would show up, all the politicians from all the parties, because they were so curious to see what we looked like. The women's movements, the activists had, given them a rough time all year. So we did these annual lobbies, and that's the extent of the influence we had in those days. And so to have a full-time paid leadership position as the first woman of color to hold that position in Vancouver, let alone as editor of its nationally circulated newspaper, was really something. And Kinesis was very radical. But even when I took the realm in 1992, issues such as free trade agreements, child apprehension, immigration policies, Indigenous land-based struggles were not really seen to do with women as things to do with women of any race. I was often accused of selling feminism out, in fact, because we started covering these non-feminist issues, supposedly non-feminist. In fact, the phrase used is I'd thrown the baby out with the bathwater, which is such a violent, bizarre image. But that was the climate then in response to any anti-racism, let alone in specific forms of Muslim or Black or Indigenous. So slide 6, all respect to the Indigenous women I met at the time at the paper, who challenged me to understand why land theft, loss of land, resource extractions and other environmental violences to the land affected all Indigenous people, including women. And then the concept intersectionality came in at that time too, which was a very useful tool. And it was a critical race theory at the time. It's become much broader and, kind of appropriated these days. But intersectionality attributed to Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins developed out of conversations with Black women, Indigenous women, and women of color in the women's movement and the academy. And it was useful on the ground in helping us explain what we already knew, that we were not single issue women or people, that our realities and politics are shaped and affected by all of who we are. Another important lesson was not to collapse differences between global and local and Indigenous and anti-racist struggles. So for example, we can draw parallels between the previous apartheid regimes in South Africa, what Israel is doing in Palestine, and what Canada is doing on Turtle Island. But we have to recognize the specificity of each struggle. We have to name the time and place of what happened, to whom, historically why, and currently how. For example, we must say Black Lives Matter and not all lives matter. Why we call out Islamophobia, specifically when mosques are defaced or attacked. And the importance of naming anti-Asian racism during COVID, even though we all felt the increased racism. And towards understanding the specificities, it was important for me to seek out these knowledges for myself, not to ask to be educated by Indigenous people, but to learn the similarities and differences for myself. And mostly by truly listening. I think that was the biggest lesson for me. So I'm going to jump ahead to the slides and hopefully they'll help me tell more of the stories I was asked to tell. So this I call 3 generations. It's how I started taking photos that were not of my own family. It was actually my father who got me started in Mombasa. He had these fantastic Leicas and Hasselblads back in the 60s and 70s in Kenya, and he encouraged me to use them. This photo captures this beautiful moment of women praying in the daytime at the mosque in Tata, Pakistan. And I was there for the first time in Pakistan. I'm from Kenya. I had never been to the South Asian subcontinent. I'm semi-proud of this image because it is beautiful in itself, but the gaze is intrusive in a way. I see it because I knew myself then as a tourist shot. The women don't know I took it. I don't know their stories. The viewer and I can only make assumptions. It's what I call the outsider, somewhat Western perspective. It's not all bad because I took it as a Muslim woman curious about a reality that's not mine, yet related to me. I didn't stick a camera in people's faces because I grew up in the tourist industry in Kenya. So I was very aware how appropriating and offensive photography could be, but not in the sense of haram, because that notion of photography as haram is a much more recent, revived, and I would say reactionary anti-Western discourse. Back then, it was not haram, even in Mombasa, for anyone to take photos. And Mombasa was very, actively everyday Muslim in a way that, you don't see here. So fast forward to 1991, the most important lesson I ever learned, and it's the basis of my photography and my photo documenting activism. And this is what makes it undeniably halal for me. So I was asked to work I was working as a reporter for Kinesis in the fall of 1991, it was before I became the editor. And I was asked to photograph the Black feminist scholar Bell Hooks, who was giving some speeches in town. And I'm sorry, I actually made the slide for another presentation. So there's a picture of Dion Brands with myself and Agnes in the middle there, Agnes Swang, who was another editor of Kinesis. So just ignore that. That had to do with another comment. The bell hooks is who I was photographing. And at one such talk, which was for women of color, I was new to the women's movement. Nobody really knew me. I felt really awkward and shy, and I'd shown up with the camera. And I was trying to hide in the corner, snapping away, trying to get that newspaper shot. When suddenly, mid-speech, Bell Hooks turns to me and points, and I'm cowering, like totally found out. And she said, we need to be doing what that young lady is doing. We need images of ourselves as people of color. We need to write ourselves into history and our stories into history. And then she said to me, you have a skill that our communities need, because at the time we didn't have cell phones, very few people had cameras. And so she said to me, never stop doing that, young lady. We need you to continue to record our politics and our histories and our lives. And that's at that point, and if you go to the next slide, that's what took it beyond photojournalism for me. Photography became my activism. You know, there's a Bangladeshi Muslim photographer, Shadul Alam, who I came across just yesterday, who talks about it being visual resistance.
आपके पास वो वायरलेस ईयरफोन्स है, आप हमेशा ये लाउड पे क्यों रखते हैं जब आपके पास है ईयरफोन्स?
Hi.
Sorry, Fatima, can you speak? We can't hear you.
Okay. Yeah, it seems somehow I seem to have gotten muted. Is that right?
Yeah, but we can hear you now. So
okay. So I don't know where I
you were talking about the visual resistance of Shahidul Alam.
Talked about okay, good. So since 1991, I don't know why my internet is unstable today. So, okay, since 1991, I have been unable to stay away with my camera because of those words by Bell Hooks, because it really impressed on me the need to bring ourselves into history in terms of the imagery, to tell the stories. I mean, today it's hard to imagine this because at the time, what we have today does not, you know, is very vastly different from what was happening in the 1990s. So I would show up at all the events, and this is the start of my solidarity work, in that I just showed up at every single event put on by Indigenous people or Black people or people of color, because I just couldn't stay home, because Bell Hooks' words about needing to show up really impressed on me the need for that aspect of activism. And so I think that's my first, I mean, that's the most important lesson that I would want to pass on to other people. And that is to show up, to march, to chant, or to show up by reading books by Indigenous people, reading reports, for example, UNDRA, the UN Declaration on Indigenous People, reading the Missing and Murdered Women reports, come to events where Indigenous people are speaking or showing art, or all the places in which we are actually being invited to show us solidarity. So it's not a difficult thing. And I'm showing this photo because this is, sorry, the photo before. After years, the photo before this, after years of taking photos at the Missing and Murdered Women's memorial marches in the downtown East Side, there have been several times where they've actually asked me to continue to do this on their behalf. But each year I have to prove again that respect, to show that respect in how I take the photos, what I take the photos of, where I share them, how I share them, because we never arrive. While we're on this land, building solidarity is an ongoing endeavor, you know, and responsibility. So for those interested in the photography angle, photography as activism, so you can go to the next slide now, sorry, Aslam. The primary way I use photography is for storytelling. So I take an enormous amount of photos and I keep them for historical purposes. I archive them and make them available to different communities at any time, you know, and of course, never for pay. Because I come from photography, from a photojournalist training, and as a historical archivist, this is the way that I have envisioned doing this work. There are many different ways to come at this. So in journalism school, if you go to the next slides, you're taught to take the photo that'll make it on the front page, right? And I had to actively unlearn everything I had learned about what makes a good photo. It's not just that one that'll tell the whole story. That is important, and we get that from the mainstream media. But as an alternative, community-based activist photographer, I did the opposite. I would take many photos and all the way through. You can keep going through the slides, all the way through the the story, so that it's not just that front page picture for us. It's the many pictures as we go along. I mean, the many stories that we see as we go through the protest. And one of the things this did, and it was someone who told me this, is that they feel not only that they were there, but people, and they felt invited into the scene. And it did encourage some people to show up. So it does have that potential, which I didn't actually think about until it actually happened and someone told me. So we're obviously building relations of trust as we show up and being present and educating ourselves and being deeply political, of course, in being invested in bringing the center out of the margin, right? And this is what informs our perspective in the photographs. To some extent, building trust these days takes less effort, in a sense, because cell phone cameras, everyone's used to being photographed now. People are used to taking photos, but I still always, when I take a photo, gesture, make eye contact, let people know I'm taking the photo. So that, and also I don't sell or debase the image by making it about me and my art, but trying to keep the politics and the cause forefront. So sometimes I take really bad photos, but I'll put that out in the sense that the lighting is not great or it's fuzzy, because it's more important to get the moment out than to actually make it about the craft, right? About the tool. So I'll let the next, yeah, you're going to the slide. So this one actually is one of my favorites, in that, I mean, this woman, I don't know if people recognize her, is a well-known activist, a Muslim refugee who came here, queer, obviously, who was in the middle of the Pride Parade taking this photo with the trans flags around, with Trudeau in the back. And to me, she's the story, right? I mean, that's the center of the story, not him. He's the fuzzy background. But it tells so much. There's so much to the story. And sorry, you can keep going. And you know, for me, one way that my Muslim identity has helped me develop my politics and my activist path is I see it, I actually genuinely see this as an ethical demand on me as a Muslim to seek knowledge and to get involved and to not look away, right? I directly attribute my upbringing in Mombasa to helping me understand more quickly in the early 90s to reject the single issue feminism that I came into here. That stressed that we act on what we know and what we experience, right? And that's important to do, but to stop there would make us complicit in racism, capitalism, and settler colonial projects. So I'm saying choosing to not get involved because we don't know enough, or to fall into the divide and rule game that pits each other as marginalized people only benefits the status quo. So, and I think I am in my conclusion. I'd summarize that what was most important for me to build in my activism as a Muslim is solidarity. And to me, that meant taking on all oppression as our responsibility, even when we don't feel the same pain. The Black feminist activist Angela Davis had said something on this 2 days after the shooting of the Muslims at the mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand. She said, the violent racism that has been produced by Islamophobia means that we all have to stand up passionately against Islamophobia. She talked about how people of color movements had failed Muslims, yet are finding themselves targets of racism during every backlash against Muslims, especially since 9/11. So connecting us in the sharing of the repercussions of each violence shows us also how violence is committed in our names if we don't speak up. And the point of this talk was to focus on my photography as activism, but also if it's halal. I can't speak as a scholar to what is halal about taking photos, but I can say, can it be haram to take and show images as an act of solidarity? Or even, is it haram to act and speak in the ways we have available to resist violence and discrimination, whatever those ways are? And I'm just going to end with, there's so much talk in this city of allies, you know, and I think to me, this talk of allyship is I find it quite dangerous because in the 90s, feminists of color worked very hard to build solidarities, to move away from the ally model. Allies are unequal, temporary pals who may share an objective or two. They're essentially in it for themselves. They're paternalistic saviors at the end of the day. When their objectives are met, they move on. Solidarity is to me a deeply political act. It's when I link my struggle to yours, when I learn to see our struggles as inextricably linked without appropriating your pain or anger or voice or struggle. So when my struggle intersects yours, it makes my liberation bound up in yours. And when you fight racism, it's not as my friend looking in from the outside, but as someone standing beside me. Solidarity, in fact, takes the responsibility of fighting racism away from the victim of that racism and implicates those privileged by it. Because everyone is in the struggle and everyone must be invested. And that's, to me, the most important thing. And I think that that's been the core of my my continued, participation in activism through my photography, right? My way of giving back. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
I can't hear. Okay.
Yeah, thank you so much for your talk, Fatima. It's deeply appreciated. And I think sharing those images is a very powerful way of documenting not only what's been happening in Vancouver over the last couple of decades, but also how you've been connected to these various movements and how you found solidarity within all of them. I'm curious if there's any questions from the audience, and maybe while folks are formulating their questions, I've got one to start off. And I think that's around, when you and I first started talking, you spoke a little bit about just the nature of that trust building, right? Like how to not go in as a savior, how to not go in with ideas of, I'm here to get something out of it. And it's so easy to make this about ourselves and let our egos get in the way of being in solidarity, right? And to see these things as opportunities for our own furtherment rather than an opportunity for solidarity building. And I'm curious about what your experience has been with that and how you've been able to sort of like ground your work in trust and relationships as opposed to something that's more opportunistic or something that you might move ahead with.
Now, that's actually very hard to answer, because I think when I said that, we're always having to work on this. I've had my ass kicked many times, right? Like by fantastic, powerful, beautiful women who have shook me and said, you don't get it, right? There have been times, but I've had the luck to have deep conversations where you can challenge these things, where we're not afraid to talk about, but things like, but you don't understand, I have my own struggle with colonialism. I was born in colonialism. Kenya did not get its independence until 2 years after I was born, which meant the repercussions. I mean, the initial, like your schooling, everything we were learning in school growing up was still part of the colonial curricula, right? They hadn't changed many things. We grew up with an innate hatred of ourselves, in a very Fanon way, right? I don't know if people have read Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, but when I read that, even though it is about Black skin, so much of it resonated with me about growing up in Kenya at that time. And so I think that opportunity to really look at yourself, and then, and I think that that's what I've learned, is to be really honest with where I'm coming from, but to own that, to own your own shit all the time. So when you're speaking with others and afraid of certain ideas, the main thing is to own where you're coming from, why you're holding on to certain things, right? And when you do that, then you're able to listen. So I would just say own your own shit, as you're going through this, and be really honest with yourself, And I know that's not an academic term, but it's really something, someone had said to me many years ago, own your shit, and then you can hear me. And so it hasn't come easy. It's a journey, and I think we all go through it in our own ways. And the main thing is to be open to it.
Okay, thank you. Giovanna's got a question.
Actually, I just wanted to have a comment. I wanted to say thank you, Fatima, for all you do. Listening to you made me think of something that has been really important to me. I've had, in my grassroots movements, I've had many encounters with the RCMP. And one of the more recent incidents that I faced was following my increased activism. I was targeted by a group of police officers who had began to assault me. And I remember, as an Indigenous woman, and my daughter was there, she was only 7 or 8 years old, witnessing this. So there was two Indigenous females in this mess. And I remember looking around, and there was people everywhere. There was even some Muslims nearby. And I was so hoping somebody would come to my aid. And yes, their aid did come. Thankfully, My 2 young sons, as well as some others that had approached the scene, started videotaping and taking pictures and giving a warning to the police that they were being watched and they should stop what they were doing to me. But I remember looking over, and this was very shortly after I had done Shahada, and I looked over and there was some Muslims that very quickly, they put their heads down and they were like, I almost had this feeling like, oh my gosh, they're new immigrants and they don't want to cause trouble with the law, and they wanted to run the other way. And I felt a little abandoned in that moment. And so what I have to say about what you've been doing is I'm so happy, and what we're doing here is I'm so happy to see that we are maybe making some shifts in how we think. And I know like immigrants do come to the land sometimes, and there's a lot of paperwork and a lot of risk that they might be asked to leave Canada. But it's really the strength of people like yourself that end up really saving us. And as minorities, we need to be brave and stand up for each other. Because, you know, there's something that you can do as an outsider looking in that I can't do from the inside, being a minority, especially when I'm dealing with authority figures. So it's just another piece where I really encourage any Muslims or anybody out there to really, if you see something or someone being wronged, I put the term haram and all that outside my head, because when it comes to the base of everything is we are supposed to work against violence. We're supposed to work for peace. And so we need to do whatever it takes to get there. And sometimes you don't know how powerful your presence can be until you step up and stand beside somebody who's going through this, or groups of people who are going through this. So thank you.
Thank you. And I'm so sorry that happened to you. And I relate, you know, in the sense of looking around and hoping someone will step up, you know. It's and it's you know, I think what you said about the Muslims standing by is an important aspect of that, because everyone has these moments of like, you know, oh, I don't know what to do, and so on. And they come from different places, but I'm glad you named why, to some extent, you know, newly immigrant or even living here for a long time, you know, we've learned to stay out of it, right? And I was talking to Aslam earlier about a concept that really helped me, actually, and that was Sanera Tawani's concept, exalted subjects. And she talks about, you know, shifting our talk from marginalization, being marginalized, to privilege, right? And exalting ourselves, right? And so when you come to this country, we're invited in many ways, as Muslims, as people of color, as Black people, as white people, to exalt yourself, to lift yourself out of a bottom position, right? By taking up these very tentative and dangerous invitations to be part of the mainstream, to be part of the whole, to avoid violence and oppression and attention and all that, by, you know, taking jobs that we actually hate, that give us more money, or, you know, looking away when someone else is being targeted, so that it doesn't stick on us, right? And so these exaltations, these ways that we gain privilege and power in a very unequal society, in a very violent society, particularly affect Indigenous people, in that, you know, I think one of the first things we learn is to step away from Indigenous people and Black people, right? Those are the two in particular, that and Muslims, someone in a hijab, or, you know, anybody that is at the bottom at that particular time. And we learn that we gain something. Actually, we do. We gain something by stepping away, by looking away. We exalt ourselves. We're not them. We're a little higher, always. I'm not explaining this really well, but because I'm really I think stripping it of a lot of its meaning. but I'm trying to get at what makes people, to some extent, not engage, right? And the society is built to make us not engage. And so every time we engage, it is, to me, the most powerful act we can take in a society like this. You know, every time we step up. Yeah, I'm reading some of the comments as I go along. There's some really fantastic things here.
And
so I hope people are looking at the chat.
Yeah, I was just going to say too, I think that anytime we have a chance to document something, or if we witness something with the RCMP, I think, from my opinion anyways, I'll say that I think anytime is a good time to step in when you see any violent encounter with police, because it seems to be increasingly an abuse of their power. And so for when I see something going on with the RCMP and a civilian, I'll usually just jump in and help, or start recording, or do something anyways. And then I usually approach that person after, and sure enough, listening to the details, I'm like, thank goodness I did that, because it seems like 99% of the time, at least where I've been involved or witnessed something, there's reason to document evidence against the RCMP or other authorities.
Yeah, no, good points, definitely. And I would say, even though it's important to do, I mean, it is also important when you're doing that to kind of make sure that you're not in direct danger. And there's so many ways to record without, feeling or putting yourself, especially if you're a person of color, in a position of danger. And yeah, so no, definitely recording, I think, is just such a powerful tool.
Shahad, yeah.
Salam everyone. Just reflecting on what Jabala said, and thinking about the photography that Fatima presented, it also forces us to rethink, well, what does Shahada mean as well, right? That Shahada is also about documenting, witnessing, recording violence that's taking place. So what understanding of Shahada did the Muslims who witnessed that violence against Jabala, what type of understanding did they have? And how can we reclaim one that is really committed to human equality and community?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, so for me, the term I use is, fidai, right? Like fidai is, for me, like Shia, it's a warrior. And to me, that term has always meant the activism we do. It's never meant violence. It's always meant speaking up, speaking out, standing up. That's the real warrior, right? That I think was always talked about in Islam. I mean, there were times when war was necessary, but I think in our times, that's how I understand. I understand what we do is as warriors, right?
Yeah, and back on that topic of Shahada, I think for myself, when I did Shahada, I didn't know enough about Islam yet to put a hijab on, or to cover my hair, or even now I still struggle with my interpretation versus what I hear many Muslims tell me the interpretation of requiring to cover up what it means. So I'm still navigating that. But when I did Shahada, and I thought, okay, well, the Muslim thing is to cover up immediately. So I immediately took on the dress and attire of a Muslima. But as a First Nations, I chose, as somebody who's of a minority in a targeted group in Canada, I chose to take that off because I had encounters with RCMP and other authority figures who now had a double reason to attack me. And so I did face quite a bit of verbal abuse because I'm First Nations and I'm wearing a hijab. And the colonialism, I felt like the colonizers or the authorities were laughing at me and targeting me even more because just because I was wearing like, to me, like the veil, another religion over top of my tribalism was sort of the comments that I received from them. And so I still struggle with that identity. And I still look for answers from my Muslim community about like, how can I progress some of my tribal initiatives and be a Muslim at the same time? Because I have carried quite a bit of anger and frustration with the system. And I feel like now I've got sort of a double layers of it going on if I put that hijab on. So the Shahada piece brings up so much for me because I interpreted it my way, like you said, Shadab, it was like a declaration. It was something to be witness to. But here I'm trying to find a platform and a voice, even just as a First Nations. And then I added this extra layer to it. So I guess I'm trying to navigate now, like, where do I go with that?
Mhm.
Mesa, you've got a question. Maybe this can be the last before we wrap up.
Sure. So a little off topic. I just was wondering, thank you for your comments. Is like, how important is it to frame the activist work you do as halal or haram? Like, is that something that's really in the forefront of your mind? Because it seems like, you know, you have a very strong conviction of like what is good to do. And like, I'm just wondering, how important is that question to you in like your daily life?
No, it's like a shadow at the back of my head. It's not important in a day-to-day way, right? But I think in the same way that, you know, we all examine what we're doing, why we're doing it, how it fits with our family and our community, and the value of it to everybody, what else I could be doing, and so on. It comes up in, but not directly as photography being haram, because in Mombasa, it truly was not an issue. The only issue was that I wanted to be a journalist at a very young age. And I was told that would make me a prostitute, because that's how they saw women getting into journalism. You're interacting with a lot of people. You know, in those days, that was the direct correlation. You're going to be a journalist, you're going to be a prostitute. And that was how I was dissuaded from getting into, you know, something I knew I wanted to do. And I only wanted to do it as the form of activism that appealed to me, because I saw journalists around me in Kenya, you know, being arrested and so on. And very few women. But if the men were doing this and taking photos and going out there and telling stories in a Muslim town, in a predominantly Muslim town, and there were Muslims, how could this possibly have been haram for me as a woman, right? So it just couldn't, you know. It's the example I grew up with. So in that sense, no, I never saw it as haram. It's a recent discourse for me.
Thank you so much. I think there's so many.
Is this the best way to relate? Sorry?
Oh,
Am I cutting out?
I think you had just before I started speaking.
Okay,
But
that's okay. I mean, I think I made my point, but it is at the back of my mind. You know, I do have to confront it from time to time in terms of, is this the best way? How do I do this? But no, for the most part, no, it's not an issue for me.
I can
And I
definitely
think,
relate.
sorry, what Jabala said about how we interpret what we're doing. I think if we bring a really deeply self-examined consciousness to why we think a certain way, and what we, you know, how we kind of relate this to our faith, it is, you know, it's important to do that. I think we have that kind of, you know, in that predestination, free will kind of way, that's deeply embedded in Islam. That free will part is really our obligation to think through what we're doing and to be responsible for our own actions, you know. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, I was just going to say that, you know, these conversations feel like they don't necessarily have an end because of the number of threads that are coming together. I think we started speaking about photography, and I think both Idrit and Shadab are mentioning in the chat box that there is a small minority of people who are very loud. And I also grew up with this notion that photography is haram, and then sometimes that just extends, right? It becomes art is haram, and then it sort of narrows the options of how to be a Muslim into a very small box. And I think it's that same small box of what it is to be a Muslim that then makes us interpret Shahada as a very particular way of proclaiming faith that is absent from the realities of documenting injustice as it comes up. And then obviously the other threads that are around gender and solidarity that are also very strong. And the example of intersectionality as well within the feminist movement that Fatima, you've got direct lived experience with that you were able to bring into this conversation. Yeah, so thank you so much for all of this conversation. We'll continue with this discussion over the course of the next day and a half. If there's any other reflections that people are having, please do feel free to share it in the chat box. It's really lovely to have multiple discussions going on almost simultaneously. Also discussions about whether people change their names when they become Muslim, relating to Jabala's point about whether or not hijab is worn, and how that intersects with this like religious cultural nexus that comes into play, where we're trying to navigate complex identities under a system of oppression that targets both. So yeah, I just appreciate the richness of all of this.